It's been called the Iroquois Confederacy, the Five Nations, the League, the Iroquois League, and it played a dramatic role in the area of the greater West New York region and really quite beyond that. We're going to be learning about the origins of this confederacy and how people have tried to determine what the date is, and believe it or not, how astronomy played a part in helping us figure out maybe when this confederacy started. We're going to we're going to be beginning to do that in a moment. And this on the State of West New York report, which as always is brought to you by.
Each week, our community makes history. Each week, you make history. And each week, there's only one source to turn to for the first take on history. You know what that is? Subscribe to the Sentinel right now to discover the history being made in your own backyard.
The Linden Honeoye Falls Lima Sentinel. More than just your news, it's your history. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. Join us each episode as we discuss fantastic topics ranging from history to science to the strange and the wonderful, as well as the treasured spirit with which our region has infused America. We challenge you to consider all things Greater Western New York, from our region's very beginnings to how it inspires, how it empowers, and why it is so admired. Here's the host of the State of Greater Western New York Report, Chris Carosa.
Hi there, and welcome again to this week's edition of the State of Greater Western New York Report. For those watching live, we started about 5 minutes late, and don't worry, we still hope to have the full half hour packed in here. So that means we're going to be ending at 5 minutes later. I hope you don't have plans. Anyways, welcome back. Our guest this week is Dr. Joe Stahlman. See, all these technical flubs is getting my mouth all flubbed up. Joe, how are we doing today? Are you all set there?
I am. How are you, Chris?
All right, great.
Yep,
So
technology is never our friend, but it is nice when it works, right?
right. So let's get right into it. Joe, I know you've been here before, but some of the people who are watching may not have seen that episode. So quickly, tell us what it is that you do as a preservationist for the Seneca Nation.
Sure, Chris. I'll introduce myself. My name is Dr. Joe Stahlman. I am of Tuscarora descent. I work for Seneca Nation as their Tribal Historic Preservation Officer. And so within this department at Seneca Nation, I look after anything that we would define as historic. And so for me, I can't be limited by the parameters of a word like historic, because all of our words in English are kind of loaded. And so when we think of historic, we tend to think of more contemporary times or how we have tracked history through time, i.e. Writing versus oral histories. And so for me in my job, and what I bring to my job is I try to bring in the whole wealth of knowledge. And so I really value and appreciate everything from oral histories to pictographs, to voice recordings, to the written record, to publications. I even follow government documentation, right? Like all of these allow me to have certain paths to understanding that past. And so for the preservation part of my job is I really want people to know how important history is. It really matters. History is the reason where we're at today, and we can always revisit history to learn from history. I'm a very strong advocate for that. I really do believe that a lot of the questions that plague us in our modern day can be resolved by visiting the past. And
Right,
so
thanks,
for me,
Joe.
as an indigenous, yes, sir.
I was going to say, go ahead and wrap it up, and then we'll get right on to it. What I'll say is we did correct the audio for our guests out in TV land. But yes, go ahead, Joe. Wrap it up, and then we'll get right into the next
one. So for me, I really like talking about indigenous histories because it really does have a place in modern day America. And I'm very happy to be here today to talk about this particular story because I find it quite relevant.
Now, I should add,
back to you, Chris.
For the listeners out there, when Joe talks about lore is very important for what we're going to talk about because a lot of the history that gets passed down from generation to generation was done orally. I mean, this goes back not just here within the peoples of the North American continent, but if you go back to ancient Greece, the same thing happened. It was verbal. It wasn't until much later that things started to get written down. I see Joe is adjusting his camera there, so we'll let him do that as we talk. And in the meantime, I'm going to pop up a map here, and I'm going to ask Joe to just kind of go over there. He is back. Joe, I've got a map of the different tribes that were across New York State and sort of around New York State, going from the Erie and Wenro on the extreme west to the Mohawk and Mohican on the extreme east. Can you explain the components of the five nations? What were the nations in there? And generally what the geographic range was very early on. So this would be prior to the 1600s.
Okay. I'm glad you put a time frame around this because, that boundary has really moved over time. So, for the sake of today, we're really talking about a very specific time when the people that we know as the Haudenosaunee, their range of influence, which was much smaller, and that really did fit into the map of New York State. So the map you're probably looking at has a range of nations, like you said in the far west. We have the Wenro and the Erie peoples. These are Iroquoian-speaking peoples, and so they're sister nations to the Seneca. And so, and then on the other side of the Seneca, we would have the Cayuga, and then the Onondaga, Oneida, and then Mohawk. But along that border with the Mohawks, we have Algonquian communities like the Mohicans, the Mohicans, and Munsee folks and Lenape folks, and so they're in that eastern part of New York State. So going back real quick to the Erie, they were brought into the Seneca Nation, during that time frame that you're talking about. But yeah, so this is kind of the neighborhood in 1100, right?
Right. So this was, well, actually, I don't know if it, I'll trust you when you say it's around 1100 that the map was still the same. The map that I had said it was from before 60. I don't know how far back, but you actually, when you talk about expanding boundaries, and we talked about this a few weeks ago on the show in the Beaver Wars, the footprint of the Iroquois Confederacy spread all the way to the Midwest and into southeastern Canada, where Ontario was. So it was very, very large in its largest extent. But the period of time that we're talking about is really the creation of this union, of this confederacy. And Joe, if you could kind of recap again what the story was on how everybody came together before we get into trying to match the eclipses to the dates, and what precipitated that. Also, I think we talked about this before. What the story that you're talking about? Correct me if I'm wrong. Is this primarily the Seneca oral tradition, or is it all the five nations that they have the same tradition, or is somebody are they a little bit different across the board?
So, Chris, you asked a lot of small questions inside of a big, large question. And
Yes,
so what we're really looking at here is the first thing that I would like to address real quick is, when we think about nations and communities, we tend to put these hard boundaries around them. And I don't like doing that because we're really looking at relationships here. And so, the Erie folks could speak to Seneca folks, just like the Seneca could speak to Cayuga folks, right? And so they're sister communities, and they also shared the same clans back then. And so those relationships were also based on clans. And so when we talk about things like Seneca, Erie, Cayuga, they're not really the hard boundaries that we think about, like the United States from Canada, right? It's not like that. It's really fuzzy. And so everything is really built on relationships. And so for us with this story, this is the first official story where people understood how those relationships were able to build a better, stronger union between like-minded folks. And to me, that's really the magic of this story, and it's really a simple one. And so you're asking me, am I telling the Seneca story? Well, no, actually, I'm telling Joe's version of the story because there's a lot of nuances to these stories. There's a lot of things that you can pull out that you find more important. So, Chris, you can embody the story into your life, and you could pull out the elements that you find important, and that's how you would share the story, the stuff that's important to you. And so for me, I really think about that union between people. And this story has been recorded over 200 times at this point. And so, there's an article that so sorry. There's an article that we're referencing here, and that is the Barbara Mann and Les Field story, right? And so they kind of go into that and talk about the nuances between just a few stories, but there's a lot out there. And it's really, like I said, what you want to emphasize in that story. And so for me, it's about union and bringing people out of a bad place to a good place. And so, you could go talk to a Seneca person and they might tell you a slightly different version, or they might just tell you the version that I'm kind of telling you today. And so for me, my stories don't come from one source. They come from a lot of sources.
Okay. So what was the basic? What are the highlights of the story that you feel it's important to share with me?
So the story starts off. It's mythical for sure. There's a story of a peacemaker who comes across Lake Ontario in a white stone canoe. So sorry. And upon his landing on the shores of what we would call New York State, he lands in the territory of the Great Lynx woman. And from this point, he begins to talk about his message of peace. And the story is quite the saga because he has a number of trials, tribulations. He's metaphorically alone in the forest for a little bit before he really has all of this buy-in. And it's really a great story because it's really a simple one where you actually talk about the ideas of love and how do you manifest this idea of love in everyday life. And in our interpersonal ways, this story of love is really utilized because it's really simple through the acts of condolence, through the acts of singing a song, by combing someone's hair. All of these simple things are really acts of love, and that's really what the story is about. And so when we think about things like peace, Chris, we have to think about the word love with peace because that's really intertwined in this and you can't tease it apart. And a lot of people do. And so for me, I really appreciate the article that we're using as a foundation here, Chris, because the Mann and Fields article, because there's so much data around this story that they could only take really broad strokes at the arguments, and they really do here. And one of my favorite parts of the article is where they're saying, hey, let's reference the community of origin here, right? And there's a section for that in the article.
So when you say that the peacemaker went across Lake Erie and landed on shore, I've got the map up. Can you kind of give us a hint of maybe where the landing first occurred, or where it occurred?
Yes. So there's 2 points of focus here. And so the 2 stories that I know of the landing point, one is in the Lewiston area. And he comes into Wild Lynx's territory, which is along the escarpment in the town of Lewiston. And so that's one place where her fortress is supposedly located.
Just so
The
that
other
people,
one is closer over.
hold on, Joe, just because we've got a lot of people who aren't from that end of Western New York. So Lewiston is just north of where you might say Niagara Falls, right on the western border.
Like 10 miles, I believe, above Niagara Falls.
Right. Okay, go ahead. And then the next point is where?
Ganonigan area, like the Victor area.
So that would be just just east of the Genesee River. On this map, it's almost where maybe the sea is in the word Seneca. So
Yeah,
those are the
I
2
can't see the
points.
map, Chris.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I'm describing it.
And so, and yeah. So for
We're
me,
gonna break.
Chris, it's not so
Hold on,
much. Yep.
Joe. Hold on. We're gonna break for a commercial right here. When we come back, let's pick up this story where you left it off. Okay. So everyone, if you want to ask questions, you can do that either in the Q&A portion or in the chat portion of Zoom, and I'll be able to answer any question that you might have. But right now, we're going to break for commercial. We'll be right back.
Through the mists of time, nature and man have both created and buried treasures beyond the imagination. With the ages, these riches slowly dissolve into mere myths until they are forever forgotten. But there are those brave souls who tirelessly cling to the truth, ever seeking to discover the undiscovered, to reveal what has always been there, to uncover the hidden gems of a land thought forsaken but loved by millions. 50 Hidden Gems of Greater Western New York. Discover the secrets in your own backyard. Buy your copy now at 50hiddengems.com.
All right, well, welcome back, everyone. On the line with us today is Dr. Joe Stahlman. He is the Historic Preservation Officer for the Seneca Nation, and he's telling us a little bit about the history of the formation of the Union of the Iroquois. We're gonna get to a date in a second, but I wanted Joe to kind of finish up what he was saying about the beginning of the story. And I know, Joe, that, by the way, folks, Joe's at a little disadvantage right now because he can't see what's on the screen. So if you see a little hiccups here and there, that's my fault on my end, not his. But Joe, what we want to work up to is that particular line in the history that talks about the height of the grass and the corn. But lead us into that where we can get into that smooth. And I'll put up the
So
map
yeah.
as you talk. So if you want to reference anything geographically, you can do that.
Okay. More than likely, I won't. I'm going to talk about culture for a minute, Chris. And so for me, when I look at history, I bring in the lens of cultural anthropology. That's one of the lenses that I bring into my interpretations. And so, with this story of peace, we have a story of relationships, and that's how you get to love. And so within all of these relationships are behaviors, and within all of these behaviors are cultural practices. Because once you start to do something and it becomes a norm, it becomes a cultural practice, right? And so what we really have here are a set of instructions given to us by the early by the early formers of the Confederacy. And within this story, Chris, we have things like gender relationship, because the wild lynx woman is the first person to accept the word. And so she's giving the extreme title of the first clan mother, right? And so that's really an honor. And that actually brings up the status of women to one of equality with men in the community. And so we have this gender equality. And so as we hear these different iterations of the story, we hear little things like that. And so these are cultural, right? And so we also know from the story that in these communities, it is the clans that you're born into. And that's probably the most solid thing that you have within these communities, is having that home foundation. And so we do have, so from that, we have a matriarch, because the first woman to recognize the word of peace is given the title of a clan mother. And so, and after her comes the chief, who is a representative, a male voice within that community. And if we think about culture again, you have to think about the types of communities living around the Haudenosaunee on your map in front of you. And so all around the Haudenosaunee, outside of other Iroquoian speakers, most peoples are paternalistic or a patriarchy. So a lot of Algonquian communities, they either have a mixed system or they have a patriarchy. And so when you have a community that has equality and some of the genders have different types of responsibilities, it isn't necessarily easy for them to go into the world and negotiate stuff. And so that's why men were given that responsibility, but it's dictated from the clan mother in the community. And so these stories are really great because it allows you to learn a lot about the community if you know nothing about it. But if you're from the community, it allows you to remember what your rules are. And so within this story, as the peacemaker is making his way across, there are astronomical signs that are clues to this date, right? But within the story, we also hear cultural practices. And for that, it goes back to the matri, the mother line, where it's women who are in charge of agriculture. And they're telling us on the second hoeing of grass, which would have been August, which is a cultural practice back then based on your reliance on maize, you get a relative date, right? So that's the first clue.
So, Joe, let me ask. This came up in the literature that I reviewed. There was reference to knee-high grass and uh, something about corn that gave the impression it was corn was ready to be harvested, which gives you this late August date. I think on the corn side, the knee-high grass, when people looked at it originally, they focused on the June date because that's when the grass was knee-high. But there was also something about when you speak of cultural practices. A.C. Parker wrote something, I think over 100 years ago, about the tilling of corn. And there were some researchers who said that this hoeing occurred in June. Is there kind of like a disconnect? How do you reconcile what A.C. Parker said or what people thought A.C. Parker said with the idea that the second tilling really occurred in August?
Actually, I can't, and I kind of don't want to,
Okay, okay. I was
AC
curious.
Parker.
Yeah,
No, no,
yeah.
no,
Tell
no.
me. Go
No
ahead. Tell
one's
me.
wrong here, right?
Okay,
No one's really wrong here. And so, we're using the best tools that we have at the time to understand this. And we don't know what kind of questions AC Parker's using to prompt his informants, right? Because he's actually collecting data. He's just not sitting there listening to a story. He's a scholar right now. And
right.
so he's trying to get his informants to give him some really good data. And so I wasn't there. I can't speak to it, but you know what? He's not really wrong.
Hmm. Well, I think
And when we think about time being kind of cyclical, 2 months isn't really that long.
so.
But
Let's.
if it was earlier in the year, they would have been talking about strawberries or something else
Right.
that is important on the calendar. Do you see what I mean here?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I
And
think
so the
that this
focus
is
is on corn. The
right,
focus is on corn, and right now we're in green corn time.
right.
We're in
And I
that season.
we want the listeners to kind of understand how. I mean, to emphasize what Joe is saying, this is an amorphous kind of discussion in that we don't really have definitive data points, but we have an understanding of what they might mean, and so we work around that. We get this period of maybe a couple of months, so over the summer, where we might want to do this. So let's start with what some of the researchers initially said. So they focused on the June date, and they may have used some archaeological evidence too. I'm not really that familiar with, but they focused on the June date and they looked at the historical record of eclipses. And I'm going to pop it up on here. This is the eclipse that they started talking about initially. So, Joe, I have a map of the eclipse and the line of where the eclipse goes through. By the way, there's also
Hmm.
you could look at other studies and there's no there's some question of whether or not we should only be looking at total eclipses or if annular eclipses count or exactly what kind of eclipse it is. But initially, what they're looking at is just total eclipses of the sun. And you can see this blue line here. It cuts across North America and it swings down through the Great Lakes over the region of Western New York. And Joe, we're focusing on Ganondadon, right? Is that the correct focal point here?
Yeah, yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, and I think that's
I
what a
didn't
lot of
really
the
have one in mind, but I didn't really have one in mind, but this works. Yeah.
yeah, and if you read the literature, most of the writers will say that Victor is where we want to focus on, the town of Victor, where Ganondadon is. And so
Mhm.
you see this one goes down there. Now, here's a little bit of the controversy that came up in some of the writing, and that is there's a number of eclipses, even around this time, that may qualify as eclipses. So it gets tougher to kind of pinpoint it. And now there is there's a train of thought that says, look, this is way too late. 1451 is way too late. The Confederacy really formed well before the Columbian era, and so some researchers looked farther back at the eclipse record, and what they found was this eclipse that occurred in 1142 in the month of August. This one's a little clearer to see on where it went. Again, the main point of the eclipse occurs in Canada, but it stretches all the way through the Great Lakes, again going through the Western New York region. So, Joe, tell us from your standpoint, uh, what does this information help do?
So, this is what I really appreciate about the Man and Fields article here, because they are really bringing a lot to the discussion. And because we didn't really have modeling to be able to do this until quite recently in our human shared history, right? That we haven't been able to look back like this. And so for me, the people that I know and the people who care about the story, they really focus on the elements in the story to help them give that time. And so with even in the Confederacy, they use the Tatahoas and they count backwards in time to figure out to an estimate. And so the modeling really helps here. And I actually agree that it's much later than what it's always been. And so one of the points that they bring out in their article is that, the people approaching this question, they never really reached out to the communities and they really just focused on what was published in the record. And so by doing that, they really have a limited view by when the time frame might have happened. And so having that 1142 date really fits into how I've been seeing things, because uh, I also use a number of things to help me see into the past. And it's not just the stories, but it's also the record of however we can find that. And sometimes that's in the landscape, the features, the imprints that people have left on the earth, but also through the stories. And so I have to turn to things like archaeology. And within archaeology, we do see things like this, but it doesn't make any sense as it sits alone. It has to be worked in with what indigenous people remember from that time. And so this is really more of a holistic piece of literature that we have before us. And the only thing really missing is the indigenous voice in that discussion, because it only exists there secondarily through reference published materials.
Very good and very very well said. I should say there's a lot of data, and no one had a camera back then to take a picture. So we have to interpret all these different sources that we get. Sometimes it's an oral history, sometimes it's archaeology, sometimes it's astronomy, I guess. There's all these
It's
different
all
data
of it.
inputs. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and then we have to interpret it, and that's the key thing. There are some. By the way, this isn't just true of history. This is also true of science. And if you go back to how even the land was created in Western New York, it is in essence a theory based on the data that's collected. Might it change? Maybe. You never know. I mean, over time, it kind of settles down on a plateau. No pun intended there. But it's an evolving thing. Joe, I want to thank you for being a part of today's show again, and thank you for putting up with our little technology troubles. As
If you
always,
ever want to do this again, we should find a different venue, right? Maybe I come
sure.
to you. But also, we should actually take a moment and wish the Haudenosaunee Confederacy a happy 881st birthday,
That's
correct?
right. That's
Like,
right.
we did not celebrate its birthday yet. And so, this is the world's oldest operating democracy.
Right.
It has never ceased. Even when they put the fire out, those principles held on and they restarted the fire when they could. And so this is the world's oldest democracy, and we should take a moment and kind of reflect on upon that.
That's right. And if you do want to be a member of the live audience, be sure to go to stateof.greaterwesternnewyork.com and sign up. It's free, and every Thursday morning, you'll receive a secret link to the Zoom platform where the show is initially broadcast. And I realize a lot of people have work, they can't get off for lunch or anything like that. You can always go to our site, it's archived there later in the afternoon. Or if you like our Facebook page or subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll see the rebroadcast every Sunday at 1:30. And with that, again, Joe, thank you very much. That's all we have for this week. Bye bye for now.